can't see it, but I'll assume it's working. So a very top tip, this is the bit I always start with, that when you see a butterfly, it's tempting to think about the colour, and you do want to know the colour, and the size, and you do want to know that. But in order to identify it down to species, the best thing is to look at the detail in the wing edges, right to the margin, not simply whether the wing edge is rounded or straight or a bit wiggly, but actually the colours and the patterns at the wing edges, including the margins. The ground colour gives you a clue to the family, but the wing edges and possibly eye spots near the edges and the margins are the best bits for identifying the families. The butterfly's size is helpful, but not definitely confirming anything. And the actions it's performing will often tell you if it's a male or a female, which is something that can be helpful because some species have males and females of different colours. And then, of course, the location where you see the butterfly is always a good clue, because some things are only seen in certain places, and the time of year, because most butterflies are abundant at some times, scarce at others, and completely absent at yet other times. Coming back to the actions I said could be helpful, if you see any butterfly that is deliberately chasing after other butterflies, flies and bees, then that's almost certainly going to be a male. If it does it repeatedly, it is definitely a male. Whereas if the butterflies are being a bit more low-key, as if they're trying to avoid being seen by other creatures, and they're flying around the plants, checking plants, perhaps landing on them, testing them with their feet, but that's how they taste, then it's almost certainly a female. Now we're going to get into the nymphalids. I have to warn everybody that this speech, talk, presentation, whatever you want to call it, is quite long. It's going to go on for 1.5 hours, I would think, and there's a lot to listen to. So I'm going to be fairly quick in everything that I do and hope that you can catch up with it. And if you can hear people shouting in the background, I apologize, but I'm afraid I'm in a house where that is likely to happen at times. Okay, the nymphalids on this side, the left, I hope you can see that I'm saying if you see what you think might be a nymphalid, an orange butterfly, then it's probably one of these here, these 5. Well, 6, because fritillary could be 2 species. But if it's darker, it looks sort of orangey, but perhaps it's more brown or even black, then it's more likely one of these on this side: peacock, red admiral, speckled wood ringlet, meadow brown. We're going to go through them, but that's just a hint. If you see something, you think to yourself, well, that looks orange, then these are the ones you're considering. And if you think it looks much darker than that, then these are the ones that you're initially considering. Peacock really is, I think, when you get a view like this, pretty much impossible to confuse with anything else. There are no other butterflies which have such colourful eyes, one in each corner, you might say, of the butterfly. So with its strikingly red colour here and these blue and yellow eyes, that is an easy butterfly. But some of the other species, the orangey ones, are much more difficult because they do look quite similar. And if you're looking at them at some distance, then you could have trouble. But the comma, you will notice, always has this very jagged outline. The painted lady always has these strikingly black and white wingtips. And the small tortoiseshell always has what some people refer to as like tiger stripes across here. And if you're close enough, blue margins. You'll notice that the comma has yellowy margins in the position that the tortoiseshell has blue. And of course, there are no such markings on the painted lady at all. So the wing edges give us all the information we want. If the wing edge is jagged, uneven, not because of damage to the wing, but because that's the shape it is naturally, comma. If we look a little bit further inside this black margin, there are yellow marks here. They're called lunules. If we look at the tortoiseshell, the wing edge profile is very regular with some little projections, but nothing like as uneven and irregular as the comma was. And inside a thin grey margin, as opposed to a fairly thick one on the comma, we've got blue lunules. Whereas with the painted lady, the top wing has a black marginal edge. The hind wing doesn't. It's got orange and black. Plus, the painted lady has black and white wingtips. So, Red Admiral and Painted Lady, these both have black and white wingtips. Really similar. Very, very similar. But as you will have noticed, I'm sure, the Red Admiral is black with red-orange coloured marks in a rough circle. And the Painted Lady is mostly orange. It can be quite pink looking sometimes, but the Painted Lady is quite orange with some black markings across it and lots of little black dots on the hind wing. So although they both share the same wing tips, in this case we're looking at the ground colour. I've mentioned here about the wing tips of the Painted Lady separated from the fritillaries, and we'll look at that later, because some people do struggle when they see this, perhaps just a brief glimpse, to work out, was that a fritillary? And we'll see later that it's these black and white tips that are the clue. That's why we always look at the wing edges before we start looking at the middles. The underneath of the Red Admiral and Painted Lady, not surprisingly, this wing tip, which was so similar on the upper side, is very similar on the under. But look at the hind wing, very much darker in the Red Admiral. The eyes are hard to see because everything's dark. The Painted Lady, very much paler, and the dark ringed eyes stand out quite clearly. So the overall ground colour is a really good clue. The Red Admiral is very dark because it tends to roost and hibernate, well, sort of hibernate, in dark places like holes in trees, bits and pieces of damage to buildings where it can get in and get out of the light. So it hibernates and roosts in dark places. The Painted Lady is very pale because it tends to rest on the ground or on big rocks in semi-desert areas. Of course, when it comes to this country, that might be concrete driveways and things like that, which it's the substitute for the sandy desert areas it lives in when it's in Africa. But it's much paler because it blends in there. Now, these four species, which are all similar looking underneath, are also easily separated by looking at the edges. Wavy outline on the comma, just the same as when we were looking at it on the top side. And a relative strong contrast between a pale outer and a darker inner, about half and half. Half light and half dark, with a little C there for comma. That shape changes slightly. Sometimes it looks more like a V, but there's always that little white mark there. Small tortoiseshell, a smoother outline, as we said, and the blue lunules. They should be obvious unless the specimen that you're looking at, the butterfly that you're looking at, has been really badly damaged, perhaps tangled up in spiders' webs for a couple of hours or something. Those blue lunules should be visible. And you can see that the pale outer part is far less than half the wing. The dark inner is bigger relative to the size of the wing. Then if we go down to the peacock, like the comma, it's about half and half, but the contrast between this outer edge and the inner is far less. So this is overall really just dark. Sometimes they look as if they're black right the way across, and it's got the smooth outline. So if it looks about half and half dark and light with a smooth outline peacock, about half and half dark and light, but with a very wavy, jagged outline comma. And here, the light and dark are not half and half, plus you can see the blue lunules. The speckled wood is a potential confusion with these because it looks dark, and when it settles, it looks similar, because in the poor light that you sometimes get in woods, it might be that when it settles, it just looks like a dark butterfly. But when you get close, you should be able to see an eye spot here. Despite the big eyes on a peacock, they're not visible from underneath. So an eye spot on a speckled wood on the forewing, and the hind wing looks a bit like a pleated skirt. The prominent veins mean that the folds between those veins give it the impression of being pleated, which stands out well if it's in the light, but could be more difficult to see if it was in a very dark place, but then you should be able to see all these little white pupils in the eyes. So all those eyes near the edge tell you it's a speckled wood. Okay, now I mentioned fritillaries. They're in the same group and they're very orange. We've got two fritillaries that might be encountered in the Upper Thames region. We've got the silver wash fritillary here on the left, which I alliterate to the stripy woodland. So silver washed becomes stripy because it's got these pale white or silvery stripes, and woodland because that's where you find it. If you see a fritillary flying in woodland, it is 90% of the time the silver washed. If you see a fritillary flying in grasslands, open areas, then 90% of the time is going to be the dark green or dotty grassland. So if you see a fritillary fly past, you will hope that it stops, because they don't always. They're capable of flying very long distances without stopping. But if it does stop, and the silver wash fritillary is more likely to stop and nectar on things like thistles in the woodland rides, dark green will stop things like knapweed in the grass, but they fly about rather more. I'm afraid that doesn't mean if you see a fritillary that flies past without stopping, it's dark green. That isn't quite that simple. But the dark green does fly about more. It takes longer flights between breaks to stop and feed or rest. But as soon as they stop, if you can see the underside, then you're looking for stripes on the silver washed or the stripy wood, and you're looking for dots on the dark green or dotty grassland. And it really is that simple. And these stand out. They're so pale, the stripes and the dots, that they stand out very well, and you'll see them in no time at all, assuming that you've thought to yourself, there's a big orange thing. Is it a painted lady? And you've looked up here and you haven't. Oops, sorry, let's bring it in now. I didn't mean that picture to be there. I thought it was on the last slide, but anyway, you haven't seen the black and white wingtips. So without the black and white wingtips, it can't be a painted lady, which means it's a fritillary, and you're just looking to see if it's striped or dotted. So let's look at the upper surface of the two, and the silver wash fritillary is at the top here, and the dark green is at the base. There are two really good clues as to which is which. Look at the way that the wing shape of the silver washed is pointy. It comes to a point, and that can be visible as the butterfly flies past if it's going fairly slowly. Quite often, silver wash fritillaries will fly up and down a ride across a patch of bramble or around some thistles, and they do a thing where they sail with their wings held relatively motionless as they glide along. And you can see these pointy wingtips quite clearly, because compared with the dark green, which are pretty rounded, these really stick out as being points. And the second way you can tell them apart is because the silver wash fritillary has orange ground colour right to the wing edge. Once again, it's wing edges that are so important. Look how the orange colour is exactly the same from the parts of the wing relatively close to the body, right the way across the wing to the very edge. But the dark green starts off quite orange in the middle and gradually gets paler as it comes to the wing edge. And again, if you're lucky and one of these flies close to you and sails, glides past, you can see quite likely how pale this edge is. And you'll have noticed it's got rounded wings, pale dots around the edges. So there are black lunules with these white spaces between the lunules and the margin. And you'll say, oh, that's really quite obviously pale at the edges. That's a dark green fritillary. So unfortunately, it's called dark green and it's got the paler edges, but I'm afraid that's just one of those things. And there's the painted lady as a comparison. The hind wing of the painted lady does look quite a lot like the hind wing of the silver wash fritillary, but the black and white wingtips mean that there can't be any confusion really. Now, I'm just going to do a couple of browns, well, I think 3 actually, but we'll do a couple of browns and then we'll take some questions if there are any. So in the spring, when we did our first presentation and our first walk, the only brown that we saw on the walk was the speckled wood, but we mentioned the small heath then because it did fly in the spring and still is flying now. The speckled wood, as it says, is about the same size as a tortoiseshell, but it looks a lot darker. And now, this week, in fact last week for meadow brown and ringlet, but this week the marbled white has joined them, and there are now 5 brown species flying about, although the marbled white, of course, isn't brown. The small heath is the only small one. The others are all roughly the same size. So speckled wood, we already looked at it. Once you see it settled, if it opens its wings, it should be easy because it's the only dark brown butterfly with these pale creamy patches and numerous eye spots. That's black pupils. No, that's black irises and white pupils. Couldn't think of the word there. So a dark coloured butterfly with creamy spots, multiple creamy spots, and eye spots on all the wings, which have black irises inside the cream and a white pupil. The underside, as we said, is darker, a bit less varied than some of the other butterflies in terms of its tonal contrasts, but it always has this pleated appearance with multiple pale eye spots on the outside of the hind wing. Now these two, ringlet and meadow brown, are very similar, and when they fly about, it can be difficult to tell the ringlet from the male meadow brown. As soon as they stop, it's fairly easy. The ringlet is very dark brown, very dark, almost black, and it has multiple eye spots. Again, like speckled wood, creamy haloed black pupils and black irises, sorry, and white pupils. The forewings very rarely have any pupils. They can, but they rarely do. And the number of spots on these wings can vary in the ringlet, but there will always be eye spots on the hind wing. You will notice the meadow brown has none. The meadow brown is also a warmer colour, more orange, very dark in the centre, and you can probably see just a hint here of a dark smudge across the wing, which is where the male scent brand, as it's called, is located. And there is the same thing, look, you can just see on the ringlet, but because the whole thing is so dark, difficult to tell. So these are both males, and they both emit scent from their wings, which tell the female that they're males. The male meadow brown always has some orange here, even if it's only restricted to around this single eye spot. There's always some. The ringlet never has any orange on this surface at all. So once settled, they're quite easy. In flight, you can sometimes see that the meadow brown is slightly oranger, but it does require good light and a bit of luck to see that. The other thing which is possible quite often is that you can see the contrast between the white margin and the dark center of the ringlet, and the fact that the meadow brown, there is far less contrast because this is sort of a grey brown color margin compared with the darker inside. So the meadow brown looks more orange, but only slightly, and doesn't have much of a contrast with its margins. And a very fresh ringlet looks darker, blacker, with a contrast that's obvious if you're lucky and it flies close to you. If they're at a bit of a distance, then you have to wait for them to stop, or you catch them, so that you can see whether there are lots of eye spots on the hind wing, which means ringlet, or none at all, which means meadow brown. Remember, there were lots of eye spots on the speckled wood, but it's got all these extra creamy marks, which the ringlet completely lacks. Now, the meadow brown is the only one of the brown that's flying around at the moment where the male and the female look different. So the male can have the orange around its eye pupil area here, very reduced. The female can have a lot more orange on the forewing. It can be extensive right the way up to the body. And the hind wing is paler too. The female's quite a bit bigger than the male. If you see a female meadow brown fly past, you won't mix it up with ringlet because it does look so much paler and so much more orange. But it's worth pointing out that these two butterflies look different, or even though they're the same species. And some people, obviously none of you, dear listeners, mix up the female meadow brown with the gatekeeper, which is more orange, but far more orange than the meadow brown. We won't look at the gatekeeper yet because, as far as I know, it's not really flying in our area. Someone will, in the questions in a minute, say they saw one yesterday or today, but the meadow brown and the ringlet are definitely flying in good numbers most places. The gatekeeper's still to come out really until the beginning of July, so about a week, and the gatekeeper will be out as well, and that is much more orange and also smaller. And the undersides, well, the meadow brown shows the orange that we were talking about quite clearly on the forewing, if you can see it, and a large broad stripe on the hind wing. The small heath, which is much smaller, has orange on the forewing and a single eye spot just here like the meadow brown. But look at the hind wing. This pale mark here is the best way to identify a small heath. That pale mark in the field, that stands out really clearly, and it's obvious that it's only on the top half of the wing, approximately half. So if you see a small orangey butterfly and when it settles you think, oh, it looks like a meadow brown, look at this bit of the wing here. If there is a pale streak going about halfway down the wing, separating a dark inner from a greyish outer, a small streak here is a small heath, and if you've got a massive white area or pale area right the way across the wing, then it's a meadow brown. The ringlet has no streaks. It's all dark apart from the eye spots, which are much stronger. They show up much more strongly on the underside, each of them with a creamy halo. And each eye spot, generally speaking, has a single white pupil. I can see some of these. It looks like there might be a hint of a second pupil, but this is the usual pattern. And usually there is one white pupil in each spot. But ringlets are quite variable and you can see them with more or less spots. They're always black with a creamy halo and a white pupil. The speckled wood, just to compare, it does have similarities, but there's nothing like the same contrast between the very dark ground colour and these eye spots. Here everything is more muted, less contrasty, and we've got this pleated pattern to the hind wing. Finally, I've put this butterfly into the group because although it isn't one of the brown family, there is a possibility that you could mix it up with a small heath. So what you'll notice, if it sits with its wings open, it's very different to the small heath, which never sits with its wings open. So if you see it with a butterfly with its wings open, it's either a dead small heath or it's something else. So it's far more likely to be something else. They never sit with their wings open, but the small copper does. And the small copper has this brilliant orange on the forewing with a black outer, and then it reverses that pattern on the hind wing with largely black hind wings with orange outers. This is the underside. The very dark black here of the hind wing has been replaced with a sort of greyish brown and an orange outer, and the forewing is orange with a greyish outer, and that's similar to the small heath, which I'm going to put up now. There we go. But you'll notice the small heath has an eye spot. There are lots of spots here, but they're not eye spots. There are no pupils. So the white pupil makes this look much more like an eye, and there's one of them. Here there are multiple spots. But the hind wing is really quite different. You might, if you're looking at the small copper, notice that it's got this orange outer. If you're looking at a small heath, the thing that will strike you immediately is this pale streak. A small area of obviously pale colour, separating the dark centre of the butterfly from the paler outer. And of all the British butterflies, the small heath is the only one where the outer part of the wing is so obviously grey. I don't think it's something you notice much in the field because it's sort of nondescript, that grey area, but this pale mark here, a small or short pale mark, is always really obvious. Just to go back to the meadow brown to remind you, on the meadow brown at the top left here, look, that pale streak goes right across. It's massive compared with the small heath where it's just a pale mark, which goes a short way across the wing. Okay, the marbled white is a member of the brown family. It isn't brown. It's also incredibly easy to identify. The one thing I would say is if you're looking at a butterfly and you think it's a marbled white, you only have to check for one thing really. Do the black areas go across the wing veins? Does it run across the wing? Because the green veined white, the only possible confusion species really, the grey or darker marks go along the veins. So I think you can see in this green vein white down here, we've got the body at this end, there's the legs, there's the antenna, here's the body, and the veins with their markings run out across the wing away from the body. But if we look at the marbled white, here's the body, and quite a lot of the black goes parallel to the body across the wing and across the veins. So it should be simple. Okay, we've done the nymphalids and the browns. Before we start wondering about the whites, I wonder whether we've got any questions about the browns.
I haven't got any questions at the moment, Nick. Nothing in the chat.
We'll carry on. That must mean that everything has been perfectly clear. Couldn't be any other reason for that.
Excellent.
Okay, the whites. As I've said, sorry folks, the ground colour isn't really any help unless the ground colour is yellow, in which case it's one of two species. But if it is white, it's useful to try and judge the size and how strongly it's flying, because very small, well, for a white, and really feeble is the species called wood white, which those of you in North Berks can enjoy in some of your woodlands, right along the border of Northants there. You've still got the wood white, the rest of us have lost it. But that is a beautiful little butterfly, small and an incredibly feeble flight. It really looks like it's flapping its wings and doesn't know how to fly properly, as if it's never had a lesson, and it's just making the best movement it can, like a kid trying to dog paddle through the or crawl in the water when they've just had their first swim and they don't know what they're doing. Slightly bigger and a slightly stronger flight, female orange tip. Now I reckon if you see any this weekend, you're doing well. They've just about finished, so I don't think any are left. But of course, as soon as I say something isn't going to happen, it will. So you might just find a female orange tip flying about still, fairly small compared with the other whites and quite feeble compared with the other whites. The other whites are, of course, the green veined and the small, and then the bigger, much bigger, large white, which flies quite strongly, rather like the small white and the green veined. The largest butterfly of all is the brimstone, but the large white comes close. And remember that the female brimstone looks white. So if you see what looks like a large white butterfly at a distance, it could well be a female brimstone. If we're looking at a male brimstone, then it's got these pointy tips to the lemon yellow wings. If we're looking at either a male or a female clouded yellow, then it's most likely this colour, which is custard yellow, And the wingtips, although a bit of a point here, got nothing like the points on the brimstone, which stick out beyond what you might consider to be the natural edge of the wing. So the clouded yellow is in relatively quite rounded. The wings follow what you might call a natural arc around here and on the hind wing. But the brimstone has got these extended points, which are really quite obvious. The clouded yellow always has a dot on the hind wing here, which has a white center, whereas the brimstone has a dot in the same place, which is uniformly dark without a white center. But the thing you'll notice about these two first is that the male brimstone is pale yellow, lemony yellow, and the clouded yellow is quite a deep dark yellow, like thick custard. And it does look very much darker than a brimstone when it flies, with the exception, I should say, of a few aberrant clouded yellows, because there is a genetic anomaly, if you like, and a few clouded yellows can look very pale, but when they settle, you think that's a brimstone, and then it settles and you see this shape without the points and with that white mark there, you will know, oh, it's one of those strange genetic anomalies where the clouded yellow is actually quite pale. And those are female. It's one of those sex-linked traits that you get in some creatures where either the male, or in this case the female, can be one of two types, and about perhaps 1 in 20 female clouded yellows are very pale and look much more the colour of brimstone. Now we're into the white coloured whites. That isn't a silly thing to say. The small white is not necessarily much smaller than a large white. Usually the small white is smaller than the large white, but some small whites, especially the females, are quite big, and some large whites, not always, but usually the males can be quite small. So you can't judge them, I'm afraid, purely on their size. What you can judge them on is the amount of black at the wingtips. So the small white has this small smudge of grey at the wingtip, and it doesn't come down this trailing edge any distance at all. It might come as far as this vein just here, but that's about it. The large white has a large amount of black scale that comes right round the wingtip and down the trailing edge, possibly a little bit further than it goes along the leading edge. So it's a big L shape, really strong. So helpfully, the small white has a small amount of grey looking scales, and the large white has a large amount of black, and this can be visible in flight. Not always, but it can be that you can tell a large white when it flies past you because it's so obviously black at the tips. The green veined white is halfway between the two. So what you'll see is that the small smudge on a small white has become bigger, but it isn't a continuous L shape like with the large white. It starts a bit further away from the body, and then it breaks up into separate little points, arcs, chevrons, whatever you want to call them. So the small white with a small amount of grey at the wingtip, the large white with a large amount of black at the wingtip, and the green vein white, can't alliterate this I'm afraid, with something between the two, but it's split into separate black marks where the veins meet the edge of the wing. So although whites are the most intensely annoying butterflies because they fly past, they're really obvious because they're white. You can see that a white butterfly has just flown past you, but very often you've got no idea which of these three species it was, or whether it was a female brimstone, perhaps if it's a bit further away from you. But when they settle, they're very simple. When they settle, small white, small smudge on the wingtip, large white, large, very dark mark on the wingtip, green vein white between the two, quite strong dark marks at the wingtip, but then a series of small arcs coming in from the wing edge. You can see the large white sort of similar, but these are all joined up and these are all separate. Now, a confusion for some people is that some of the white butterflies they see have a single black dot just here. This is called the cell spot disposition. And others have the cell spot and more black marks as well. And they think, well, that's one species. What's this one? But the answer is these two are both the same species. They both have a small amount of smudge at the wingtip, so they're both small white. This one's a male with a single spot, and this one's a female with either 2 or 3 spots, or actually, as more often, a sort of smudge of grey going all the way back towards the body. So it could be that we were looking at a small white like in these pictures, or a green veined white, or a large white, and we would see the same difference between the sexes. A single cell spot, black, in the male of all 3 species, and several spots or even a dash in the female of all 3 species. I'm just putting in a female brimstone to show you it doesn't look yellow, and when it's settled it doesn't look all that white. It looks a very pale green. Still got exactly the same pointy tips look that the male had. And that mark, which was brown, and I said you don't get a white centre in it, well, in the female it does look a bit more like that on a clouded yellow, but these pointy tips are a good clue. The female green vein white, as we said, one black cell spot and then some more marks, including usually a streak. And you can see again there's a smudge, but then there's these separate little arcs coming in at the veins where the veins meet the margin. So female green vein. The brimstone, I've just noticed I wrote it down here and it's a good point. The brimstone always settles to either rest or feed with its wings closed. The other whites can settle with their wings open if they wish, but the clouded yellow, like the brimstone, settles with its wings closed. Okay, let's look at the undersides of the whites, the 3 whites. Small white with let's use this small again, a small amount of grey scales in the bottom half of the hind wing down here. This area doesn't really have many grey scales at all. The green vein white has its scales scattered about, but always along the veins, obviously following the veins. And the large white has its scales scattered about randomly, but over the whole hind wing surface. So this top half of the hind wing doesn't look any less scaly than the bottom, whereas here there is a difference I think you can see. The large white tends to be scalier with its black scales than the small white, and the small white can look really quite yellow. The large white tends not to look quite so yellow, even though it probably is, because the yellow is covered up slightly by these black scales, which are more extensive. And probably worth pointing out, you can see the extensive black marks on the upper side through the wing on a large white. Such a large amount of black that it shows through the wing. Here, of course, is not much to see because the small white has a small amount of greyish scales there, just about visible through the wing of the green vein, but nothing like as clearly as through the wing of the large white. The wood white, when it settles with its wings closed, it can settle with its wings open, and the females and the males will repeatedly flap their wings open and closed in their courtship. So you could see it with its wings open, although normally when it sits it has its wings shut. I hope you can see it is a completely different shape. Look how elongated these wings are. If I just go back to the previous slide, quite round really and a bit pointy there. Similar shape but slightly more rounded, and again quite rounded but a bit pointy. But now wood white, very long and thin. So those of you in the north of Berks who've got the opportunity to go and see this charming little butterfly and feel perhaps a little bit smug because the rest of us don't get the chance. There are none at all these days in Oxfordshire. There are none at all in Berkshire. There are none south of Milton Keynes in Berks. So some of you have got the special chance, or all of us, I suppose, if we're prepared to put very expensive fuel into our vehicles and go up there. Some of you in the north can go and see this fantastic little butterfly, whose caterpillars eat various vetches, not the cabbages and crucifers that the others eat. This absolute gem is up there in North Berks, and luckily we see the numbers are increasing very slightly because several landowners up there have been moved to try and manage their woodlands a bit better. So a bit less management for pheasants and perhaps for commercial logging, and a little bit more management for nature conservation, with more attention to the management of the ride sides where the woodwhite flies. In Northamptonshire, in Salsey Forest, the Forestry Commission have done a good job, and the woodlands there can be quite rich in this butterfly if you go at the right times. At the moment, the woodwhite's sort of between broods. There are still some about, I expect, but very low numbers. Numbers will be picking up again as we go through July. Just in case you were going to mix up the green vein white, which also flies in woodlands in reasonably good numbers, remind you that it's got these grey marks going along the veins. And in the woodwhite you can see, look, the grey smudges go across the veins, very similar to the marbled white going across the veins. Okay, are there any questions, please, Carla, about the whites?
No.
Okie doke.
No, I had
Hey,
any.
I've either mesmerised everybody or they're all really happy with what they've heard. I won't hesitate to suggest it's the latter. We'll go on to the blues, unless you've something else to add, Carla.
No, that's all. I'll let you carry on.
Thank you. So, the blues. The ground colour is helpful. That's good, isn't it? Because we said about the whites, it wasn't really, not really, very much help.
Stop the press, sorry. We have got just a quick question.
Okay, and the question is?
Are the antenna of the woodwhite a good identifying feature? They look a bit different.
We'll go back. Yes, a bit. They are a bit different.
Oh, yeah.
They are slightly droopier, and they tend to be black and white. Now, I forget which. So you can see the green vein white has black and white. In the wood white, and I'm afraid I've forgotten which way round it is, I think it's the female is entirely black tipped and the male has white in the tips of the antenna, but I might have got that back to front. So you can tell the sex of a wood white by the antennal tips because they're different. However, you can also tell the sex by watching what they're doing. So if they're flying about investigating other flying things, they're males, and if they're trying to lay eggs on plants, they're females. But if you find one on a gloomy day just sat still doing nothing, then a clear photo of the antenna tip should tell you whether it's a male or a female. So they are slightly different, but they're not so very different from the others that would be an easy way to. If you had a picture only of the antenna and none of the wings, I think you would not be able to tell which species, but they are different. They just sort of droop over as if they've lost the strength to hold themselves quite so straight out as with the others. I hope that's covered it.
Thank you.
We can come back to it again later if that isn't what you meant. But I'll push on with the blues because there's quite a lot to do, and we are getting on for, once we've got through the blues, we're definitely more than halfway through. But there is quite a lot to do with the blues because people struggle with the blues. I've said that the colour is important, so let's talk about size as well. The small blue and the brown argus can be minute, really small, so small that people might well walk past and not even realise they are butterflies. The silver-studded blue is a bit bigger, but still small. I don't think you'd see it and think that can't be a butterfly, it's too small, but you would see it and think, blimey, that's small. Common blue and holly blue are sort of average size for blues. And another butterfly which has just started to fly in the last few days, the purple hairstreak, can look bluish as it flies past you. It looks darker really than blue, but it's about the size of the common blue and holly blue. And then the chalkhill blue, which isn't flying yet in our area, but did start to fly in the UK this week. And the Adonis blue, which was flying and seems to have just stopped in its first brood. So if you were really lucky this weekend, you might see a last Adonis blue before they're all done. for the spring brood, and then the summer brood will start again in late July. But I put it in because when I prepared this talk, I didn't know that people were going to be telling me over the last couple of days, it looks like the Adonis blue are finished. Anyway, smallest of the small and brown Argus, silver-studded blue, not much bigger, common blue and holly blue, sort of average size, the size you normally think a blue butterfly will be, purple hair streak about the same, chalk blue and Adonis blue are larger, but not massive. We're not talking the size of a meadow brown, they're still small butterflies. Now, quite often you'll see blue butterflies flying about, and if they're being really awkward, they'll fly past you, keep going, or over a hedge, and you'll never know what they were. If it looks absolutely brilliant blue, there's a chance it was Adonis. If it looks pale blue, then perhaps it's holly blue, especially if it's flying high up. And if it's purpley blue, maybe it's a common blue, and that's most especially like the Adonis blue actually, if it's flying around between sort of ankle and waist height. Holly blue often above your head. If they fly past and they just look dark, or perhaps silvery, but usually dark, probably a small blue or a brown Argus. Unfortunately, the females of all these, of these, Adonis and common, not the holly, the females Adonis and common also look dark when they fly about because they are brown. So unfortunately, despite being called blues, some of the female blues are brown, and the brown Argus and the small blue, as we're about to see, are pretty much brown or black all the time. So anything that flies around or even settles near you and your initial opinion is that looks sort of silvery green or very dark brown, it could be a brown Argus because the male and the female are like that. If it looks silvery when it flies and then brown or very, very dark blue when it settles, it could be a female common blue, a female Adonis blue, or a small blue. The male and female small blue and brown Argus are smaller and silvery and very dark. Now we can look at some pictures in a minute, but I just brought this key in, and I can appreciate that this might be more useful to you if you come back at some point and listen to the recording again. But I think this is really quite helpful. So begin by asking yourself, when you're looking at one of these blue butterflies, something you think is a blue butterfly, does it seem to you that the upper wing colour is very brown or very dark grey or almost black? In which case we go to the question number 1. Well, it could be a brown Argus or a small blue, so we're going to worry about that in a minute by question 2, or it could be a different species. So if it was brown Argus or small blue, question 2, can you see any red lunules? If there are no red, if there's no red of any sort, in fact, but the red lunules are the red marks near the edge of the wing. So if we see something very brown and very dark, we say to ourselves, that could be brown Argus or smooth blue. Can we see any red on it? If there's no red anywhere, it's a small blue. If there is red, it's probably a brown Argus. But the brown females of 3 species do look similar. And here we're talking about something that's slightly larger than a brown Argus. And instead of having red lunules, it has orangey red lunules. That's a subtle distinction, and if you only see this one butterfly without the other to compare, I can see why you might say, oh, is that orangey red or is it red? But also, these 3 females tend to have blue scales near the body. We'll see all this in the picture in a minute. And then a completely separate question up here when I said, well, what about if it's blue? If it's pale, silvery blue, average size and flying around the top of a bush, and if it does settle and you can see that there are no red lunules, then it's a holly blue. So remember back here, if there are no red lunules, but it's very dark and very small, it's a small blue. If it's very pale silvery blue and no red lunules, it's a holly blue. If it's an average size purpley blue with a clear white border, it's a common blue. And if it has blue studs, silver studded, blah, blah, and the black veins, Adonis or even Chalkhill later in the summer. So let's look at the pictures. Here we have that first pair that I talked about, the ones which look silvery when they fly about, and when they settle you can see they're really dark. The brown Argus on the left, very dark, very smart, beautiful little butterfly, but with red lunules. These are red. This is not orange. And if you look at the white margin to the wing, you can see that the veins that come through the wing extrude or get through into the white margin, leaving black marks where they protrude into the white margin on every single wing. If we look at the small blue, there is no red, whether we look at the upper surface or the underside. The small blue is completely without red, and it's also completely without anything approaching blue, really, apart from a few blue scales which are just dotted about on the body and the nearer the body on both sets of wings, but it looks black almost, doesn't it? And it's tiny. So those two should be easy to separate. We're just looking for red, which is striking. And then the holly blue, you might confuse with a small blue if you see it settled, because settled, the holly blue also has no red lunules of any sort, no red, and no red on the small blue. But if the holly blue opens its wings, it will be blue. The male and the female are both blue like this. The other thing that you can tell if you get a picture and you want to look at it later, or if you remember to look for this detail at the time, is that I always think it looks like someone has taken a calligraphy pen to put the black marks onto the white surface of the hind wing of a holly blue. These all look like little streaks with a calligraphy brush. If we look at the small blue, we can see when we look at it closely, well, actually it's not so much white, the surface, as silvery, and there are white rings, black dots. These are not streaks. They might not be perfect dots, but these are obviously little streaks. Here we've got white ringed black dots on a silvery surface. And if you want a third way of spotting a difference between them, you'll notice that the veins on the holly blue go through the white margin, but only on the forewing, this top wing. The hind wing down here is clear. That's the only species of blue butterfly with one wing with black veins checkering the white border, and the other one clear. This one's completely clear. All the other species are either completely checkered or completely clear, but the holly blue is half and half. Holly, half and half. Holly flies about a head height, higher than the others. And I stuck this in. This is a day flying moth called the chimney sweeper. You can see how it looks like a small blue, and it's a similar size. If you see a chimney sweeper, a caterpillar food plant pignut, so if you're somewhere where you know that pignut grows, it's possible, then you'll notice it's got white wingtips, and the small blue definitely doesn't. Okay, now the brown Argus that we spoke about earlier has to be separated from 3 blue butterflies females which are also brown. That makes sense. 3 of the female blue species are actually brown and not blue. The female common blue can look quite blue in part of the wing, but most of the common blue is brown. This amount of blue and brown varies, so you can find some quite blue looking female common blues, but there's always brown somewhere. And I hope you would agree with me, the lunules are more orange than red. And you can see, this is a fact, they don't go right the way up the wing. The brown Argus, much smarter appearance, far more contrasty, the colours are all more saturated, and it's red lunules. But remember, the other thing is the common blue always has a clear border. there are no black veins sticking through. The brown Argus always has these black veins visible. Well, I say always. If you find a fairly fresh specimen, I suppose if something's chewed the edges off the wings, you wouldn't be able to see that. But this red colour and the contrast of that red with the dark chocolate is really quite striking. And the brown Argus is such a feisty little butterfly with such strong contrast. Its behaviour and its very smart appearance usually help you to spot immediately that it's not a common blue, which looks rather dowdy by comparison. So it's not just that I've deliberately muted the colours in the picture. This is a genuine difference between them. The brown Argus slightly smaller but much smarter appearance. Female common blue slightly bigger. The brown isn't quite so concentrated dark brown, and the blue is sort of scattered about the body here and there and not concentrated in a strong way anywhere. And the lunules are sort of pale orange compared with the brilliant, almost scarlet red on the brown Argus. One of the things that's very important though is to remember has a common blue has a clear border. So here's silver studded blue. Now the silver studded blue only flies on the heathland in Berkshire. So if you're in Oxfordshire or Buckinghamshire, you will not see a silver studded blue that's flying around naturally in the wild. But if you go to Berkshire, in eastern Berkshire, on some of the heathland where it's not all that far from Surrey, you can find silver studded blues. And the silver studded blue female looks a bit like a female common blue. They've both got clear borders, but the black inside that white clear border is wider, and the lunules here have got little nicks out of them where the black border goes into them. So these orangey lunules are shaped by it. And here you'll notice on the common blue that the lunules do have bits taken out of them, but they're partly white or very pale blue occasionally. So the appearance is quite different. It's also very rare for a female silver studded blue to have anything like this amount of blue. So a bluer looking brown female something is more likely to be common blue than silver studded. So if you're on heathland in Berkshire, you could see both these species without too much trouble. The silver studded blue is the scarcer of the two, but can be quite numerous on those sites where it does breed. So you might see both of them and you might think, oh, is that one a silver studded blue or a female? Look at the amount of black in the wing margin, and then look at the hind wing where these lunules can have little nicks taken out of them by black margin creeping in. The female common blue, it's much more likely to have these white extrusions or whatever they are, intrusions I should have said, I do beg your pardon, of a sort of a paler, sometimes very pale blue colour into the red lunules just inside. Now the common blue and the brown Argus can pose problems if you find them roosting and not moving about in cool weather, but actually there's a really good way to remember them, which is that the common blue has a clear border, i.e. no black veins. And the brown Argus, as we've already said, does have black veins coming in. If the specimens that you're looking at are worn, all this edge has been rubbed away by banging around in the grass or getting tangled up with spiders' webs and things, then another way to tell is that on the common blue, where it says dot here, you can just see a dot which is partly hidden by the hind wing, but there is where that dot is. And if we look at the brown Argus in the same position between the head and the cell spot, remember we mentioned the cell spot with the whites, there's the dot on the common blue, and there is an empty space or a bare area if you want to alliterate. So the brown Argus has no spot at all just there. The common blue almost always 99% of the time does have an obvious spot just there. And as if that wasn't enough, there's another way of telling. If we look at the hind wing, there are dots inside the red lunules. There's a band of dots. Both butterflies have them inside the red lunules, a band of dots. If we look at the common blue, we can see that these, I wouldn't say that this is a perfectly symmetrical arc, but it's a fairly smooth arc. Do you see? In the shape of a letter C, because it's a common blue. If we look at the brown argus, they're much more higgledy-piggledy. In fact, you could argue it looks a bit like the shape of a comma. Not a comma, what am I talking about? A question mark. But they are definitely all over the place. And always, just here, which is this spot and this spot on the common blue, this spot on the common blue has moved in the brown argus, so that we get what looks like a colon or figure 8 just there. So to go through, there are 4 differences which definitely tell you whether it's a common blue or a brown argus. Common blue, clear border. Brown argus, black veins through the border. Common blue, a dot here on the wing. And brown argus, a bare area where there should be a dot. The common blue, a smooth arc on the hind wing, and the brown argus, a broken or interrupted arc because one dot, at least one, possibly 2, have moved, giving you this figure of 8 or a colon. And then a 4th way, which usually works quite well, this is a very well marked common blue. The orange, as opposed to red, don't always go to the top of the wing on a common blue, but they always go all the way on a brown argus. Okay. Now, female common blue, we've looked at it already, and the female brown argus, very similar. Brown argus, what I'm talking about, Adonis blue. Start again, sorry. Female common blue, which we've already looked at, and the female Adonis blue. They look similar, very similar. The Adonis blue might not be flying at the moment, as I said, but they probably are still just about in a few places. And you will notice that whereas there is a clear border on a common blue, there are black veins coming through the border on the Adonis. And in addition, the Adonis, these lunule marks here, these blue ones, are an absolute clinch that this is definitely Adonis. Now they can be very pale here, but they're not ever quite so obviously blue. Having said that, as the female Adonis blue wears over the first few days, this blue coloration here tends to fade. So that isn't really much of a help unless you see a very fresh specimen. But the female Adonis, whatever its age, always has these black veins through the margin. The male common blue and Adonis. The male common blue, of course, has a clear border. And the Adonis blue male has a clear border. No, it doesn't. It has a border broken by veins that give it this checkered appearance. And obviously, it's a much more striking blue. But if you're out in the field and you only see one blue butterfly, then it's difficult to make a decision about, is that blue enough to be Adonis, or was it not quite strong enough blue to be Adonis and it was a common? The answer is look at the border. Clear border, common blue, checkered border with black veins coming through the white, Adonis. Generally speaking, if you've seen a fresh male Adonis blue, you're in no doubt at all. That blue is so intense that you cannot really confuse it for anything else. But some common blues, when they're fresh, are also very blue. So you do need to check them carefully. the male common blue and Adonis blue undersides, you can't look for the arc that I described to separate them because it's the same in both really. You can't look for the amount of orange lunules because neither of them really have orange lunules on the wings, but we know that common blue always have clear borders and that the Adonis blue, like the brown Argus, always has black veins through the borders. So if you look at the pictures, which one has clear borders and which one has black veins through the borders? I'm sure you got them the right way around. Okay, male silver-studded blue and male common blue. As I said, you're only going to come across this problem if you're down on the heaths in East Berkshire, but we mentioned for the female, the same for the male. The silver-studded blue has a very wide black inner margin with little black triangles coming in to the wing. Now, with the female silver-studded blue, they came into the red lunules that go around inside here, but there are no such lunules on a male. But you can still see these little apexy, pointy, chevrony things coming in from the margin. And with the common blue, it's a much thinner black margin with no hint of anything protruding. So they both have clear borders, but this one does have a thicker, especially on the hind wing, jagged appearance just inside the margin. Okay, pointing to one of the triangles there with a red line, but I think it was probably obvious anyway. And the undersides, well, the greener blue of the common blue with a clear border can be obvious, but again, it's this thing, if you've got both of them sat next to each other, that's fairly obvious, and if you only got one of them, then you might well struggle to work out how green that blue is and whether it's blue enough to be silver studded. What we're looking for is slightly different shape to the orange lunules here, which are nothing like as pointed. These are almost a U shape, aren't they? Getting on towards a V, whereas here they're just little C's, black, and a few of the studs here, as they're referred to, have these blue dots, blue scales, bright blue scales. So I'm not quite sure why someone called it silver studded, because it's obviously blue studs. And it can be 3 of these black areas here with blue dots in them, or it might just be 1, or if the specimen is worn, it might be none. But the overall appearance is slightly different. It looks slightly more petite and rounded than the common blue, which looks a bit longer in the wing. And the lunules here are much more pointy. The points coming in towards the body. Here they're much more rounded. Okay. So here's a bit of a quiz. On the left is one species commonly seen in our area, and on the right a different species. I've shown you the uppers and the undersides for both. So what do you think? I'll give you a few seconds.
I was going to say
Oh, I beg your pardon. Are you going to say holly blue for the one on the left?
I was going to say that's holly blue for sure. Yes.
Oh, of course you were. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. But let's see, what do people think? Do you want to tell us what you think for the one on the right? You could say no.
No one's put me.
Yeah, you, Carla, because everyone else is muted, I think.
They can unmute themselves. Someone's put Adonis.
Oh. Well, what do we know about the borders?
It's clear borders, so I was.
It is clear borders, so what's that?
I would say it was a common.
I would too.
Yes.
So common blue, clear borders. All right. So before we get on to the skippers, are there any questions about the blues? I know people can struggle with the blues, but I really think that listening back to this recording and looking at that key as the way to separate them, it can be learned. It is possible, and as long as you know what you're looking for before you see the butterfly, it can be done very quickly. The trouble is, if you see the butterfly and then try to think to yourself, oh, what am I supposed to look for? It might fly away again before you've decided, am I supposed to be looking at the underside or the upper side and so on? Please try and remember, folks, look at the edges, because a lot of the blue butterflies you'll see will be common blue with a clear border. And if you can see that, then you know it's a common blue. And if it doesn't have the clear border, then you can start wondering, oh, what could it be?
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick.
Any questions?
No, there's no any questions. I was going to say, all I can say is that I'm glad we only have 3 blues and not greens.
Well, you're missing out on something, because those of us with a few more, we enjoy our blues. They are very pretty.
One day I will venture further afield.
Yeah, we'll come south and see some of the beauties that we've got. Anyway, let's move on to the skippers. So 2 spring skippers, all of them fly about very quickly, and it's quite easy to lose track of where they've gone. But luckily for you, the male skippers, not the females so much, but the males do tend to come back to wherever it was they were sitting before they flew off. So if they've flown away because you scared them by walking towards them, just stand still. They'll probably come back, and then you'll get a look at them. The 2 spring species that may just be flying still, I reckon up in the north of Oxfordshire and the north of Berks, you might still just find grizzled skipper in some of the woodlands, some of the better woodlands with wider rides, just possible. The dingy skipper is still flying, again in the north of the county rather than on south-facing hillsides in the south, which are much warmer. But this butterfly is going to come back. So by July, a second brood of this butterfly will be flying about in those places where it was flying around first of all in April. So it will have laid eggs on bird's foot trefoil actually, and the caterpillars will have grown so quickly with a lot of sunny days this year. Even though the nights have been cold, the days have been sunny, so the caterpillars will have developed quickly, and we will get a second brood of dingy skipper. Second brood of grizzled skipper is in theory possible, but very, very unlikely. It grows more slowly. I don't think we'll get a second brood of grizzled, but they might still be flying. So we're going to notice that the grizzled skipper is quite obviously not quite black, but very, very dark brown and white. Series of individual white marks on the dark background. And there's always this funny little shape here, a bit like a tooth, wisdom tooth with its 2 roots. And the dingy skipper is more stripy than spotty. It's got these 2 bands of dark marks on a grey or sometimes brown background. So they're relatively easy to separate, and they certainly don't look like the orange skippers that we see in the summer, which are just beginning to fly now. So the orange skippers of the summer are of 2 types really. There's the large skipper, as shown here, and then there are 2 other sorts of skippers, the small and the Essex skipper, which look like this, and they are so similar that although if you look at these closely you can tell which species they are almost indistinguishable. So let's worry first about how we can tell whether we've got a large skipper. One thing is that the wing edge here is a quite dark olive brown with the orange ground colour showing through in a few spots. And the underside, you can see that olive colouring again with some paler spots just visible. Now these can be very faint, but they will be there. And another top tip for looking at a large skipper and deciding it's large skipper is to look at the end of the antenna. This funny little point that comes out the end, which I always say reminds me of a Turkish slipper with that little pointy bit sticking out the end. The small and Essex skippers have very blunt ends to their antenna. They do not have that little point. That's an important point because those of you who know a bit about identifying skippers, probably most of you, will know that you tell the small and the Essex skipper apart by the colour of their antenna. sometimes people forget that the Essex skipper has exactly the same colour as the large skipper, but the Essex skipper has a blunt antenna and the large skipper has these pointy bits. But we'll get into that in a minute. So large skipper, the dark margin, dark olive brown with orange spots showing through, and underneath these pale spots are usually visible. Certainly they are if you get a good view in good light. Now, the large skipper could be confused with the Essex skipper because they both have black antennae tips. But you should be able to see these creamy spots. And here the whole thing is orange, almost exactly the same colour all over. The Essex skipper has blunt antenna, and the large skipper, as I said, has points to the antenna. This particular camera angle makes it impossible to see it there. Oh, and I think this is worth repeating. You can't simply go on the fact that one looks bigger than the other because they're both small. They're both so small that most people seeing a large skipper would say that's small in the sense that it's a small butterfly. And I don't think you can tell just by the size. They're too small and the difference between them is, minuscule really. So you need to see them settled. Look for the pale spots on either the underside or the upper side of a large skipper and the completely uniform orangey colour of the Essex plus black tips. Seen from the underneath, by the way. The small skipper and the Essex skipper, this is not the case with the large skipper, we're talking about the small and the Essex now, have different shaped scent marks on their forewings in the male of the species. So the female has no scent marks, that doesn't help. But the small skipper, rather unhelpfully, has a large mark. The Essex skipper has a much shorter and much straighter mark. So here you can see, perhaps hopefully it's almost in the shape of an S, a flattened out S, but it's certainly a squiggly long mark. And here it's a short straight one. But the way that you can normally tell your small skipper from your Essex is to look at them from very low down, where you will see that on a small skipper underneath the colour of the antenna is pretty much the same all the way right to the tip. It might get gradually darker, but it's a very gradual change, and it usually finishes orange or brown underneath. On the wing surface, there is definitely a slight difference between the colour of the tip of the wing and the hind wing compared with most of the form wing. This is slightly sandy grey. This is orange. In the Essex skipper, the underside is almost all the same colour, but even more obvious, even at quite a distance. I use binoculars to view them at a distance so I don't scare them away. You can see how there's a really abrupt change from an orange stem to what's referred to as an inky black tip. So small skipper, we've got that the small skipper is showing some slight changes in the colour across the wing, and the Essex rarely shows much change, but the antennae are an absolute clincher. Orange, gradual change, sometimes dark all the way from the body, or the head I should say, to the tip of the antenna, but there's no real obvious change in the colour. It's gradual. But the Essex skipper, an absolutely striking, abrupt change, looked at from underneath, a change from orange to black. The small skipper can look black on the top of the antenna in an abrupt change, but the underneath of the antenna is the way to go, because the underneath of the antenna in the small skipper is a gradual change and the Essex skipper is an abrupt change. And just a reminder that the large skipper does have black tips. This one doesn't look very black, but usually there is black on the tip of a large skipper, but there are these pointy bits which help you to say, well, that can't be a small skipper, or in Essex, because it's got pointy bits. Okay, now there are unfortunate, well, I don't know, that was, I wish I hadn't said that, but I'm going to start again. There are fortunately quite a lot of day flying moths about as well at the moment, and I think they're really great, but I do appreciate if you're trying to learn your butterflies and you begin to think, oh, this is a bit of a lot to remember, it's a pain to discover there's lots of other things that look a bit like them. Let's just go through very quickly. Silver Y moth. You will see these in the undergrowth, and you might mistake that, the Burnet companion, the mother Shipton, small yellow underwing, and these two, which are tiny, but you might think, oh, they could be skippers. This one flies very rapidly into undergrowth. It sort of dives in, and when you see it settled, its wings vibrate almost continuously. Plus, it's got this little mark here, which is the silver Y of its name. The Burnet companion looks very orange when it flies, and it also usually dives into cover, but can occasionally sit on things when you can see this clearly orange hindwing, which allows you to say, well, that's not a skipper, because it should either be orange everywhere, or it shouldn't have any orange at all. These little things, as soon as you see them settle, I mean, not only are they incredibly beautiful, far prettier in my opinion than any of the skippers, but also they're just too small. So when they fly past initially, you might think that could be a skipper, but when they settle, you'll see they're too small, and they both have these orangey blobs, this on a sort of chocolate brown, this on a really beautiful purpley colour, and then gold coloured stripes across the hind wing, a bit like the orange here, and the yellow on the small yellow underwing, which also looks a bit like a really small dingy skipper, but with these yellow bars on the back. I don't know why, because these are different families of moth, but they all show this similar yellow at the back. Presumably it's some sort of warning coloration that warns birds off, but I'm not sure about that. And a similar theme in the hummingbird hawk moth, which I hope all of you get to see this year. Incredible little creatures, hovering in front of the flower, feeding with very long tongues stuck into the flower. Sometimes they use their feet to help balance themselves, but usually they don't bother. They just hover in front of the flower, and then they zip sideways to the next flower. Incredible. And the mother Shipton, which can look a bit like a grizzled skipper with the black and white, but you can see, if you look, the shape of the mother Shipton, who was a famous witch. Here is her long nose. This dark mark is her long nose. Then there is her eye, the eye spot there, coming down past her cheek to her upper lips, her open mouth, and then her very large protruding chin. So there's her face. That's the mother Shipton. Obviously, if you remember the grizzled skipper, it's just black and white spots all over in a random pattern. But here we have what looks, if you use your imagination, like a face. There are a lot of white day flying moths, a lot of white day flying moths. Some of them are absolutely beautiful. So we've got the common carpet with this nice blue across here in a really fresh specimen. The silver ground carpet, which is much paler. The almost completely white, but with such a beautiful patterning on the grass rivulet. The bigger than the skippers actually, treble bar or lesser treble bar, they both look almost identical, but each of them has these 3, 1, 2, 3 bars of grey or dark chocolatey brown across the centres. And plume moths. Plume moths come in various colours, from a sort of sandy colour through to almost black in some of the dark brown ones, but the white plume stands out as being perhaps the most beautiful. It looks a little bit like a crucifix in shape. When it flies, it looks like another moth, but when it settles, it folds its wings into this peculiar shape. There are, at the moment, all these day flying moths about. So the cinnabar, which has this striking red underwing and a long red stripe there with 2 red dots. The 5-spot burnet, which has no streaks of red, but 5 red dots. Now in parts of Berkshire you might just find a species called 5-spot burnet, but all the rest of us, we're seeing the narrow bordered 5-spot burnet, which is a very, very closely related species, and I think as far as I'm concerned they're impossible to tell apart. But those who can tell, usually by rearing the caterpillars through, tell me that in Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire and most of Berkshire, if you see a burnet moth with 5 red spots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on each wing, then it's a narrow bordered 5-spot burnet. And very similar, the 6-spot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spots, the 6-spot burnet. And then a couple of slightly larger but very striking moths, the Jersey tiger with its white stripes and then orange and black hind wings, and the scarlet tiger with white spots, not stripes, over a red and black hind wing. And these are all flying at the minute. I've seen all of these except a Jersey tiger today, despite the weather, because one of the good things about day flying moths is they will fly about in weather that's slightly too dull to tempt butterflies out. There are quite a few day flying moths that look sufficiently sandy brown that you might think it could be a small or a large or an Essex skipper. For instance, the shaded broad bar, where you can see this broad central orangey bar. The common heath, which can look quite grey. Some specimens have exactly the same pattern, but the ground colour is greyer. And the yellow shell. Now, I don't think this is my best photo of a yellow shell, but it's not a particularly pretty looking yellow shell. They can be exquisite, with the yellow and darker markings on the wing in a series of what look like repeated little wavelets across a beach, or, as the name implies, like the markings inside a shell where the shell has grown and laid down little layers each year. They are beautiful, but you need to see them very closely, and yellow shells are not very obliging. They normally dive into the vegetation head first, and when you do find them settled, they're behind a leaf upside down, so it's very hard to get a picture. And then there are green day flying moths. You won't find any green day flying butterflies at the minute. I believe the green hair streak's the only one you might see has finished. So there's the small emerald, which is beautiful, the green carpet, which is exquisitely patterned, quite small, and the forester, which is iridescent green when you see a fresh one, as I did today. Absolutely beautiful little moth, relatively small, but not much smaller than the skippers. And then we've just got a couple more butterflies left, the hair streaks. I haven't included the purple hair streak in this because I didn't, or have I? Did I? Let me just, no, I didn't think so. I didn't include the purple hair streak in this because I don't think we're going to see them for about another week. I thought probably there was plenty in this talk without adding them in. So we've got white letter hair streak here, which is the one that most of us in our 3 counties will be seeing if we see a hair streak of this sort. But in the north of Oxfordshire and the north of Berks, people are lucky to have 2 different species, and one of them is the black hair streak, the other, of course, the white letter. The white letter, you can see a solid, as it says here, black line that goes all the way down inside this red band. A continuous black line. But with the black hair streak, a much rarer butterfly, restricted to a very few sites in the UK, but many of them in our counties, you can see that all these little black bits are separate. It's not a solid line at all. It's a series of black blobs, which even extends onto the forewing, look. No such black here on the white letter. Now, the white letter can be told by this white W here, which is fairly obviously a W shape. And on the black hair streak, it's not quite so obvious, but a word of warning. That isn't always visible. It wears away. And it's much, much more sensible if you can see the butterfly. And I have to admit, very often all you see of these things is they're flying around the top of a tree And when they settle, they manage to do it so there's vegetation in the way and you can't see them very clearly. But if you can see them clearly, telescopes can be helpful, but binoculars almost certainly are needed. You want to look for this solid black line, whereas with the black hair streak, it's separate black blobs. And if you are going to look for the black hair streak, then I would suggest you get on with it in this coming week, because their numbers will drop rapidly at the end of the week. And this year so far, most people are saying the black hair streak's been a bit hard to find. So definitely worth getting out and looking for it. The walk that I'm leading on Saturday as a follow-up to this, we're at Hyde Park Wood, where the black hair streak has been recorded. It would be wonderful to find one and show it to people on Saturday, but I'm not making any promises, because Hyde Park Wood isn't somewhere where the black hair streak is guaranteed. People have looked for it, and I should think perhaps 1 in 20 people who go looking find it. So
I have an update on that, actually.
Oh, go on,
I
please.
think Martin did find it the other week before I went on holiday, so he has seen one in Hyde Park Wood. So fingers crossed.
Oh, well, yeah, everything possible that can be crossed will be crossed, and we will look very hard at all the blackthorn and all the flowers around the blackthorns. Great,
Yeah.
that's good news.
And also, there was one question about the black hair streak.
Right.
Someone has asked, has it disappeared from Oxford below Shotover on the edge of, is it
Brasenose? No,
No,
it is still in small numbers at Brasenose, but rather like Hyde Park Wood, it's one of those things where quite a few people go and say they can't find it, and then somebody else goes and says, oh, I found one, I saw one. So it's just a very small population. And I'm afraid all the hair streak butterflies are much more patient than we are. So they're prepared to sit still for 45 minutes, whereas after half an hour of looking at the same few twigs, we get fed up and move off. And then 10 minutes after you've gone, it flies around, and you would have seen it had you been there. But then it sits still for the next 45 minutes when somebody else turns up to look. So it's just that they're very, very good at doing nothing for quite a long time. Very hard to pick them up because so often they're near the top of relatively tall bushes and small trees. It's difficult to see them if they sit still. So our best bet is that either one flies or that there's one down on flowers feeding. And luckily, both these species do come down to flowers, especially if we don't get much rain tomorrow, because when the weather's dry, they're more likely to come down to flowers. So I'm hoping that tomorrow will be relatively dry. Okay, any more questions? Because we've now come to the end of the presentation about all that. So there was, skippers. I don't think I stopped at the end of the skippers, did I? And the day flying moths probably won't get too many questions, because that's a bit of a...
We had a question about the mint moth, just how small they were. I mean, I would say they were definitely smaller than skippers.
Oh yes, half the size.
They've said, I've seen a lot of these over the years, but have never been able to identify them from books. So that's the mint moth, but they're teeny tiny.
Teeny. Yep, really small. Incredibly beautiful, but very small. When they're fresh, they're gorgeous. They're not quite as nice as the other moth. Where's the picture gone?
The golden.
So this one called the common purple and gold. The colours on this are outstanding. They're absolutely gorgeous. And the undersides of both are pretty as well, but they are tiny. We're talking about the size of your little fingernail. So we're talking really small.
Yes.
But they're so pretty, it's worth getting your, if you're like me, getting your reading specs on and having a close look. They're gorgeous.
And just to take that, I think everyone will be looking forward to the recording so they can go through it again. And I
do know. I have gone fairly quickly, because I think if I go slowly, although it might give you more time for the information to sink in, it takes forever. So it gets tedious by just being too long. I'm just going to make a plug that when you now that you can identify your butterflies with great confidence and accuracy, that please record them. The only way we can protect places is by knowing what they've got. So when developers come forward and say they'd like to build a new shopping centre, out of town shopping centre type place, or a distribution warehouse. I hear there's a brand new one going up in Milton Keynes. They found a roundabout without a distribution centre, so they're putting one in quickly. And it's only when we know what lives in these places before the planning authority get the request for a new building to go up that we can help to stop it if that place is in some way special. And everyone thinks the place near them is special, but very often they don't think to record the butterflies and get them logged on something like I Record Butterflies, or the PC version of this. If you don't like using your mobile phone, you prefer the PC, using this one, which is one of Butterfly Conservation's apps on a PC as opposed to on your phone, then all that data needs to be recorded, because we can do a really good job at saving places. 2 nights back, I was in a meeting about the Gavray Drive Meadows, Gavray Meadows local wildlife site that's going to be a nature reserve. The developers of housing in Bicester adjacent to this site have accepted that it's so exceptional for butterflies because of the records of butterflies there, that they've set aside about just over a third, a bit less than a half of the site to be a nature reserve. And they're putting money into looking after it because they appreciate that they're making money from the houses they've built on the remainder of the site. So with the right records, and in this case, some local people who said, you can't do that, you can't build on it, it's too special. It has all 5 species of hair streak, for instance. And the developers have agreed. They've said, you're right, it is too special, we'll protect it. So there can be good news stories, but we need the records first. Okay, I Record, by the way, this particular version of it, not the I Record Butterflies, which is just for the butterflies, records everything. So while you're at it, if you're out there and you see a plant, an animal, a bird, even a fish, anything, stick it on I Record, it all helps. A plug that it isn't just the walk I'm doing on Saturday as a follow-up to this. There are lots of other walks, and I've got a feeling this might be, yes, this is all about the videos we've already made that Carla has very carefully recorded and that we've posted on our website. So you can watch recordings about other things, but on this same page at Butterfly Conservation Upper Thames branch events, you can see all the guided walks we're doing, all the indoor meetings that will be coming up in the autumn, and so on. So loads of information there. Please take a look. Recording and surveying, if you're not quite sure how to use those apps I just mentioned and the PC program, then have a look at that. That video is all about it. And that's it. I really have finished talking. I'll be very, very pleased to answer any questions you've got, but I'm going to be quiet for a few seconds. You'll be pleased to hear. And it's over to you. I'll try and stop sharing if I can find a way to do it. I really did struggle with this before, but I think I've spotted it. Yay! It's gone.
Andrew asked earlier, are there many hummingbird hawk moths around this summer? I've not seen one yet.
I saw one today, and I saw one a few days ago, so they're definitely coming in. I think that warm weather, when we got up to about 30 degrees, brought a whole load of them in. So they are in, but it's because they're such relatively small creatures and they zip about so quickly, you need to be in the right place at precisely the right time. 2 minutes later, they've gone. I was a little bit miffed that somebody who lives in the same town as me said they'd seen 3 in their garden. When somebody else asked, has anyone seen a hummingbird hawk moth? I thought I saw one. They replied, I've just seen 3, and I haven't seen one in my garden yet. But I think the numbers will probably build this year. If, like most sensible people, you don't mow your lawn and you've got any bed straws growing in it, then hummingbird hawk moth caterpillars eat bed straws. So if you've got ladies' bed straw, which is the very pretty yellow one, or the white bed straws like heath and hedge bed straw, that's the food plant for the hummingbird hawk moth. So another very good reason to never buy a mower in the first place. And if by some awful mistake you've got one that somebody gave you as a present, to just lock it in the shed and leave it there. Padlock it in the shed.
I read mine.
Good.
Pat, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about the moths you saw in Oxford on the Boundary Brook. I wasn't quite sure about the question if you put one here. And someone else raised their hand a minute ago, so Pat says she saw several small day flying moths over the hay meadow on the Boundary Brook Nature Park. Do you know that in Oxford?
Yeah, sorry. I did cut. It's from Oxford Urban Wildlife Group, Nick. I was the one who contacted you about managing the grassland areas for butterflies. Yes, 2 or 3 times I've seen several of these very small. I thought at first they must be a new sort of butterfly, but then I saw that, you know, when they did stop, they actually had their wings open, but I could only ever see them perched when they were facing me. But flying, I could see that they looked sort of greyish, but with patterning across the forewings. And the only thing that looked nearest to it on the pictures you showed was the heath butterfly, moth.
Yes. Well, there are, I think, 5 species of moth of a type called carpet, and it could be those. There's a common carpet, silver ground carpet, a wood carpet, another carpet is broken barred carpet, and they all look basically black, silver, and white. So when they fly, they look grey, and when they settle, they look mostly black and white, or very dark grey and white. So I think it may well be a carpet moth, but
Yeah.
To identify them, you really do need either a very good picture, or best thing is to catch them briefly in a jam jar or something and have a good look.
Okay, thanks very much for that.
You're welcome.
I'll have a try.
Yeah, good luck. It's not easy, so good luck. Catching them is the first challenge.
Yeah, definitely. I haven't got a butterfly net, and I'm always a bit wary of catching things in case I hurt them.
Yeah, well, if you can get a photo, it is possible from photos, but it's always, with moths, it's so difficult because they deliberately hide themselves in the vegetation to avoid predation, so it makes getting a photo difficult because the bit you need to see on the wing always seems to be the bit that's behind a leaf.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot. So I've only got a very cheap smartphone, so I'm a hopeless photographer. But Helen Edwards, who's the